So I want to talk about something that's been on my mind for a while. I'm just gonna adjust the sound here. Hopefully this is a little better. And maybe I can make this lighting a little better. I think that's sorry, just playing with the lighting. Should have done this sooner. That's good. Okay, better lighting. Yeah, so I want to talk about the troubled teen industry. So you may have heard of the program, you may have heard of the Netflix show, The Program. The complete title is The Program, Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping. And if you haven't seen it, I did mention it in a quick short that I did, but I do recommend that you watch it, particularly if you are anyone who has been through narcissistic abuse or has a narcissistic family or parents or has been abused in any sort of institutional. If you are a survivor of one of those programs, then absolutely, it might be a little triggering for you. It might, hopefully won't re-traumatize, but I think it's important to watch. And the idea of the troubled teen industry, even the word troubled teen, what does a troubled teen even mean, right? So in the show, it looks at a group of survivors from a school known as Ivy Ridge in upstate New York. And it was created by Catherine Kubler, who was sent to this school in the early 2000s. She was 16, and basically she was sent off to boarding school because her dad had remarried and her stepmom basically just did not like her. We can get to that later with what happens with certain family dynamics where kids also end up in these schools. So they were also very Christian, very evangelical Christians, and that's going to matter also with the theme of this. And she was sent to a Christian boarding school, and she was expelled for drinking Mike's Hard Lemonade. So just one drink. Good kid, great grades. Yeah, Mike's Hard Lemonade. And so they were supposed to pick her up at the school, but instead she was kidnapped by two strange men and put in handcuffs and basically taken to Ivy Ridge. And it was sort of peddled as some kind of therapeutic school, like a place where kids get better. And if you looked at the brochure, there was horseback riding and everything looked lovely and idyllic with swimming. And it was not that. It is prison. In fact, it was worse than a prison. And she was put into a program where was basically comply, obey through manipulation, fear, violence. They had all kinds of weird rules, like no looking out of the windows, no talking, no making eye contact. You have to have someone there when you're going to the bathroom. And so, it's really a very sinister place. And so she made this documentary to bring light to this, and they left everything. They left all the documents, all the files behind. And I think what's really important about this documentary as well is that I think it kind of can help bring a little bit of closure and a little bit of, kind of therapeutic for her to have made this, especially because other survivors join her and they're able to talk about it kind of together and bond over that. And I think it's so important because one of the things these schools or these so-called therapeutic troubled teen institutions do is they separate, they do not encourage any kind of relationship. In fact, it's kind of that divide and conquer idea where they want everybody separated and against each other and telling on each other, and kind of like a Lord of the Flies situation where only the adults are in charge and in control. So it's very authoritarian. It's what happens in dictatorships, what happens in authoritarian countries where get the people all suspicious of each other. And it's exactly that dynamic that happens in these places. I don't even want to call them schools because they're not schools. It even turned out later in the documentary, they found out that all their so-called high school diplomas were fake. There was no real teaching going on. They were sitting around, they were watching homeschool stuff that had no real learning, sometimes just copying out worksheets over and over again and doing ridiculous things. So just a really a lot of trauma takes place, and it's under the umbrella of the Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs in Schools, WWASP, fitting name. And I'll get to more of that in a minute because the history can kind of be traced back. So the troubled teen industry, it's a broad range of youth residential programs aimed at struggling teenagers. And there are what they call residential treatment, not a lot of treatment happening, wilderness programs, boot camps, and so-called therapeutic boarding schools. Now, even the whole concept of the troubled teen is very problematic because, first of all, most of these kids would have outgrown this. I mean, most of these kids, they're just acting like teenagers. That's what teenagers do. Sometimes they get into trouble. They talk back. Maybe they drink a little. Maybe they dabble in certain things. And most of them are gonna, if you just kind of leave them alone, they're mostly gonna outgrow this behavior. But they also had kids, they had kids as young as, I think 11 was one of the youngest kids, not in this documentary, but in another one I watched called Hell Camp, which I'll also get to, was one of those wilderness programs. They had kids as young as 11. And one kid was sent there because she was depressed. And another kid, like, they run away, or they're getting into trouble, or they're depressed, like they're anxious. Can you imagine you're being punished for being anxious or depressed? So it's really it's just a weird thing that goes on where kids that are suffering, kids that are struggling are being punished for that. But then they're labeled as troubled teenagers. They're labeled in a way where no one is supposed to ever believe them. So imagine, you're a teenager, you're a child, and you're in one of these programs, and then your parents are getting letters that say, they might write you a letter saying, oh, I'm being abused and it's terrible here and I want to go home. And they're telling you that your kid is just manipulative. They're just a manipulating liar. Do not believe a word that comes out of their mouth. So these parents, especially, again, I'm going to talk a little more about this later, but a lot of these parents are very trusting of authority. And so they believe what they're told. And they're kind of like throwing their hands up. I don't know what to do with my kid. And so they get some other person telling them what they should do, and they just kind of go along with it. And a lot of this stems also from coming from very traditional backgrounds. There's a lot of evangelicals, there's a lot of Mormons, there's a lot of people that are already big rule followers, and that also really ties into it. Because if you're someone who comes from more of that extreme end of any type of religion, where you are supposed to obey authority, then first of all, you're going to look to some kind of leader. You're going to look to someone and they're going to tell you your kid needs to go here. And you might end up believing them, but you're also going to see your kid as obstinate, or you're going to see the kid as not obeying. You're going to see the kid as someone, your children are supposed to obey you, and they're supposed to be little perfect mini adults. And so even things that maybe another parent might think, okay, so, my kid talks back to me sometimes, that's what teenagers do. It doesn't mean you have to love it. It doesn't mean you can't talk to your kid about it to be more respectful and teach them, guide them. It doesn't mean just leave them alone to do whatever they want, but there's a nice balance, there's a balance between being an authoritarian parent where you must be in control all the time, 24/7. Your kid better do what you say or else, or being a complete, doormat parent, or they're called, the jellyfish parent, where they're just like lay down and let your kids do whatever and run rampant and don't give them any structure. There's something in the middle, right? You can be in the middle of this. In fact, Barbara Coloroso wrote a fantastic book about, parenting. And she talks about those three types of parents. So we have the authoritarian, we have what was called the backbone, and then we have the jellyfish. So the backbone parent, backbones are flexible, they stretch, they grow. That's the parent that we kind of want to aim to be, where we give our kids some structure. we guide them, but at the same time, we also accept them for who they are. We accept that they're going to struggle sometimes, and we are flexible around that. We give them what's known as loving guidance, loving attachment, not authoritarian, you're in the army and I'm the sergeant, you better listen. So getting back to the whole troubled teen industry, I just wanted to tie into that because these parents are ripe for this. These parents, or they're very naive, or they don't understand the way, or they're seeing the people around them and what their kids maybe are like or not like. They're comparing, but also it could be their community. If somebody in their community sent their kid there, it's like kind of like a pyramid scheme, like an MLM, where now they're saying, oh, well, Johnny went, like Sue's son, Johnny went to this program. You have to send your kid. Sometimes they try to get in whole families and they bring these kids in and they get them to like write fault, like things. They tell them they're doing drugs. Like they create all these bizarre scenarios. The other thing they do is they try to scare parents by saying, if your kid doesn't go into this program, they're going to die. This kid's going to die. And there's some fantastic books written about this. There's a book, I'm going to actually link it in my resources, by Maia Szalavitz, or sorry, I'm pronouncing her name wrong. Sorry, Maia. But fantastic book that she wrote way back in 2004, and she did an update in 2020 where she talks about this. So if you want to know more about this in more detail, there's some fantastic articles and books and stuff out there. And then if you can stomach it, there's also great books written by some of the survivors that really take you inside of this horrific industry. So if we get back to the history of this, so going back, the precursor to this was a drug rehabilitation program called Synanon, and it was founded in 1958 by Charles Diederich. By the 1970s, it had basically developed into a cult, and they even claimed it as a Synanon religion, and he was the highest spiritual authority. And so they did something called the game, which was in a form of attack therapy. Now, attack therapy has completely been debunked. It is not helpful. It's incredibly harmful. But they used to have these encounter groups back in the 60s and 70s, part of the human potential movement, where you would basically get piled on by everybody, obviously the opposite of what we want to do to help somebody, right? But basically members were encouraged to criticize and humiliate each other. And they also popularized the whole tough love thing. And then the attack therapy is a treatment for addiction. And then he kind of figured out, or decided, this guy wasn't a mental health professional, by the way, decided that confrontational and verbal condemnation could cure adolescent misbehavior. It did disband in 1991 after they lost their tax-exempt status, and they ended up being bankrupted. But unfortunately, they were still highly influential. They were inspired by the self-help organizations such as EST, LifeSpring, and then the whole, part of that human potential movement. It was then used in something called Straight Incorporated and The Seed, which were two drug rehabilitation programs for youth. So former Synanon member Mel Wasserman founded CEDU Educational Services in 1967, which operated and worked with troubled teens. And he founded a whole bunch of schools, and he went on to use the game and this attack and all sorts of things, and just sort of adapted it to work with. Now, the difference was Synanon was adults, so they were choosing to be there and they could leave. It was their decision. These kids, it's not their decision. And what happens as well is a lot of them are kidnapped into this, which I will also discuss a little later. So stay tuned for that fun topic. So their techniques inspired what was known as the Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs, or WASP, WWASP, which is the umbrella organization that ran the Ivy Ridge School, and many schools also in Costa Rica, Jamaica, Mexico, which eventually were shut down by those governments. So isn't it interesting that in those countries, that was too abusive for the authorities, but in the US, it's perfectly legal. And there are huge lobby groups that are lobbying to keep these things going because there's a lot of money being made. It is over $1 billion industry, and it can be traced back to Utah. Um, so basically, there's no evidence-based therapy. There aren't even therapists. There's no there's no mental health training. There's nobody with any credentials. Most of the staff are not even trained. A lot of them are pulled from A meetings or right off the street, or really, you don't need any credentials. You really don't. And so imagine the mix of people they're going to get. And Ivy Ridge was paying them, I think, $5 an hour. Can you imagine $5 an hour? You're getting like, maybe that was minimum wage at the time. I don't know. So you're making minimum wage in, the early 2000s, and you have no experience. And then what if you are a narcissist? Imagine you're a narcissist, or you're even a sociopath, like that. You have your own issues, or you're just really unhappy through life. You get to take it out on these kids. So the abuse, you see the layers on layers, how this is just a cesspool of abuse and torture and neglect and horrible, horrible things that went on. And so now we're going to go to the kidnappings. Many troubled teens institutions offer youth transportation through teen escort companies. And what it is parents actually sign up for this and pay extra to have their kids kidnapped. Okay, so imagine you're a 15-year-old and you're sleeping and it's 3 a.m. and you're sound asleep. All of a sudden you hear a noise. 2 big burly men come into your room and you're thinking, what the hell? And you're all disoriented. They grab you, they put handcuffs on you, they drag you out of your room. And you might see your mom and she won't make eye contact with you. And you're going, Mom, help, help, help. And she won't even look at you. Maybe she's crying, but no help from there, right? The betrayal, the abandonment you would feel. And then you're carted off in the night, maybe put on a private plane, then you're driven several hours in the middle of nowhere and you're deposited into this strange place, and then you're told you have to stay here. And maybe you might have to stay for years. You have to earn your way out, and by earning your way out, you have to abuse other people. So imagine the damage this does, the damage that you have been kidnapped, and that betrayal alone is going to cause PTSD. That is something you're going to struggle with, that betrayal for years. And then on top of that, you're in this horrible place. You have no control. You're not allowed to talk to your parents. Your parents aren't even supposed to be writing you. If they do write you, they censor your letters so that when you do write something, you can't tell them the truth. If you do tell them the truth, guess what? Your parents have been told not to believe you because you're a manipulative brat, basically, right? And so it's just horrific what goes on. And then at the same time, they monitor your phone calls. So even if you do get your once a month phone call, they're monitored. Maybe you got 5 minutes. The parents don't believe you, even if you try. And then eventually I think you can earn, I think Catherine ended up earning a visitation with her dad. And then she can't even tell him what's going on at the school because she has to fear reprisal. And then even if she does tell him, he's like, no, that can't be happening. That can't be true, right? So again, there's all this gaslighting and not being believed. And then, basically it's false imprisonment. 19-year-old Fred Collins Jr. found himself falsely imprisoned by what was known at the time was Straight Incorporated after initially visiting a family member who was enrolled. So he visited a family member. He was thrown into a windowless room for 6.5 hours. The staff refused to let him leave until he agreed to enroll in the program. At another New Mexico program, Tierra Blanca Ranch, the authorities found the adolescent clients had been shackled and handcuffed. They have forced labor at some of these places. It's like being on a chain gang. What is this, the 1930s? I mentioned the kidnapping, stress positions. That's another thing they do. They put the kids in stress positions, which is a form of torture. One of them described her having to lay on her belly for hours with her arms outstretched. Do you imagine the pressure on the body and what that does to you? And you would have to basically dissociate just to cope. Strip searches, restrainment, where kids have been killed, they've been harmed, or even one poor kid was smothered or crushed by someone sitting on top of him, a huge heavy guard, a 16-year-old boy. Solitary confinement for weeks, sometimes months. And then, of course, the ongoing psychological abuse. At Ivy Ridge, they did have a riot, and one of the students was asked, he did have to go to jail. He said, "What was prison like?" He said, "Oh, it was like a 5-star resort. I loved jail. Compared to Ivy Ridge, jail felt like paradise." You imagine? So basically the timeline is 1967, we have the CEDU High School founded. That was from a Synanon member. We go into the Elan School. There's a whole documentary about that one. Horrible. And that was found by Joe Ricci, another scumbag, basically. Then we've got the whole just say no to drugs thing that took place in the early 80s with Nancy Reagan, who was First Lady at the time. And she was very impressed when she visited a straight incorporated school in Florida and spoke very highly of it. So you imagine the influence she had. And then we had somebody in a school, the Elan school, they were forced to box each other, and this kid was fatally harmed, basically. So then we go on to 1984. Princess Diana and Nancy Reagan then visit another straight incorporated school. Even Scientology got in on the game, and they opened a troubled teen program in California. In 1995, there was a boy that died in one of the wilderness programs in Utah. It goes on and on and on. Then in 1998, Robert Litchfield created the WASP, the Worldwide Association of Specialist Schools and Programs. And guess where he is? Guess where he comes from? Utah. He's a Mormon. There's a huge Mormon tie-in. There's a huge evangelical or Mormon or very traditionalist, very, I'm going to say it, right-wing oriented Christians who are involved in this program. So it goes on. I'm not going to go through the whole timeline, but it goes on and on. As early as late as February 15th, 2024, the Open Sky Wilderness closed after years of controversy. So you can see that there was a manslaughter investigation at Trails, Carolina, pending a manslaughter investigation in February 2024. In February 3rd, a 12-year-old passed away at the Trails Carolina Wilderness Program. So you can see that a lot of these are still in existence, and all these horrible things are still happening. There's so many good programs to watch. So I would recommend, aside from the Netflix show, the program Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping, I would recognize Hell Camp, Teen Nightmare. That talks about a wilderness therapy program called the Challenger Foundation, and it's in Utah. And then there's the Paris Hilton documentary. There's one called The Last Stop, which is a documentary about the Elan School. There was one called Boot Camp about a one in Samoa. It just goes on, right? Yeah, and so if we go into, just wanted to go back to the documentary. Yeah, so now that I've kind of given a backgrounder, and like I said, read some of those books. And by the way, if you're not watching this live, you're watching this later, and you're bored by the history stuff or the factual stuff, you could always fast forward through that part. And because the important stuff I really want to get into is what this does to the kids, what it does to the parents. It irrevocably harms relationships. So again, so sorry, I got a phone call came through on my phone. So probably I'll edit that out later. So yeah, where was I before that phone call came through? That's the thing about doing live, right? Unpredictable stuff happens. I can't put in any fancy visuals either. So also, if you are stopping by, please let me know if there's anything that you want me to talk about, or even later on. Sorry, allergies. That wasn't pleasant to listen to, I'm sure, but let me know if there's anything that you want me to talk about, or if you want me to go in more into this topic, you want me to talk about other things. So I want to tie in now the idea of how, first of all, okay, so there's two things going on. I talked about the very strict authoritarian parents that have very traditional values. Then we can even have, getting into that cult idea. You could have people from there, but surprisingly, you might even get some more progressive, like woo-woo parents, because if they go for that whole cult-like thing, the thing about this is that parents also attend groups. And so the parents are going to attend groups that are synonym like, but the difference is that the parents can leave anytime. The parents are choosing to go in these groups, but they kind of prey on the parents as well. So this is where this sort of pyramid scheme comes in, because the parents are going and paying money. They're paying. Oh, the other thing is these groups, going to these programs cost upwards of 30 grand a year. Right? So you could send your kid to a really good private school for that money. I mean, these are not poor people we're talking about. Yeah, maybe some people do take out a second mortgage, but these are mostly middle class to upper middle class to even wealthy people. These are not people that can't afford treatment. And I think that's even the sadder part. They could get actual, like, if their kids need help. And again, a lot of these kids don't even need, but let's say they could use some therapy or even like some sort of treatment. Outpatient is always a better option unless you absolutely have to do residential. They could send them to an actual accredited program with actual therapists where the kids get real help. But instead they get roped in. So there's something about these parents that somehow are very vulnerable to, and there's the cult-like mentality where these parents will go to their own groups and do all these crazy, counter groups, attacking each other. They also have them do things where they're embarrassing themselves. And I always wonder sometimes if that's kept as blackmail. If that, because Scientology does that. If somehow the parents dressing in crazy clothing or doing these insane things, if somehow that's used as some sort of leverage. I always wondered about that. It'd be interesting if someone did some research around that. However, because my topic is about because my channel is about narcissistic abuse, I want to also tap in to the narcissistic parents. Now, first of all, big disclaimer before people, get upset. I am not at all saying that every single parent who sends their kid to one of these programs is a narcissist. However, there are some who are, or they're abusive parents, or neglectful, or even in Catherine's case, when she was sent to the school and then the other place, it was her stepmom that had issues with her. So sometimes it could just be like a new family dynamic happens. You get the evil stepmom, the evil stepdad, whoever is coming into the family, or maybe dad has a new family. He doesn't want to be bothered with the teenager, right? So there's a lot of discarding going on here. So even if these parents aren't narcissists themselves, they might have married one or got involved with one, or there's obviously still a they're not standing up for their kids, because any parent who stands up for their kid, you're not going to send your kid to a place like that. Because here's the other issue. You might be fooled by all the fancy stuff, but I know for me as a parent, I'm going to do my research. I'm not going to just take their word for it, right? I'm going to maybe want to talk to other parents. And again, that can be tricky because some of the, to give some parents credit, they did talk to others, but they were parents within their own community, right? So I would want to do an outward search. And then not only that, if I'm told I can't talk to my kid for several months, no, right? Just no. Not only that, but there's no way in hell I'm sending a 12-year-old away for years. That is never going to happen, right? The most I ever did was send my kid to camp for maybe 6 to 8 weeks. And then I knew the camp and I knew the people and I knew I knew it was safe. And not only that, I could always go and see them if I wanted to, and they could come home anytime if they wanted to, if they weren't happy, right? And I missed my kid when they were away at the camp, or even though I knew that it was a good place for them to be. So, I just sometimes can't wrap my head around. I know this as a therapist, but as a parent, it's sometimes hard for me to wrap my head around about how on earth you send your kid away for such a long period of time and not really have contact with them, right? Even residential treatment programs are usually no more than maybe a month, even a few weeks, maybe 6 weeks. But you can visit, So I guess that's the other thing that hurts my heart a little bit is this idea of discarding your child or abandoning them. So now let's get to the really abusive parents. Okay, so if you're a narcissistic parent, there's a lot of things you couldn't get away with in your own home that is not legal, thank goodness. But kids don't have a lot of rights. Now in Canada, I think our laws are a little stricter around rights because we don't, when I did a search on these types of schools in Canada, nothing really came up. Now there are troubled teen, I guess, institutions. But when I kind of looked them up, there weren't any, nothing else came up around it, like only those institutions. So I would hope that if these are bad places, something else would come up in the search. Now, I'm not going to say these places are amazing by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think we don't have the same kind of industry going on in Canada as you do in the US. However, unfortunately, some Canadian kids do end up in these programs. A lot of them are kidnapped and taken illegally over the border. And then the worst part is they don't even they're afraid of them leaving because they can't get back in, right? So they even keep a closer watch on these kids. So anyway, to get back to it, the narcissistic parents, this is completely legal. There's a lot of money to be made here. So a lot of lawmakers look the other way. Whole towns, like Ivy Ridge, that was their whole industry basically was working. It's like when you have the prison, the prison, the company prison, I call it, the town where the prison is the only industry and everybody works at the prison. This is very similar. The difference is at least a prison has some rules and regulations around it. I know abuses happen at prisons too, but prisoners have more rights than these kids do. These kids have basically no right. Their parent gets to decide everything. Their parent is the authority. So if the parent makes a decision and it's a really bad decision, because unfortunately not all parents have good intentions. There's this idea out in the world that all the parents have good intentions and they don't want to do what's best for their kids. And yes, there are many parents do. And there are the ones that do not. And so these narcissistic parents, what a great way to punish your kid. It feeds into this idea too that, oh, my kid's bad. My kid, see, they told me too. It's been validated. It's been validated how horrible my kid is. And so they're perfectly happy to send their kids off to these places. And then those kids are going to, it's like almost a form of punishment or use like a threat. If you don't behave yourself, I'll send you off to, one of those programs. And then a lot of these kids, there are kids who literally, not that anyone deserves to be there, but literally had no reason to be there. None. There was this one poor kid that he was sent there because his mom died. And he ended up in the foster care system. And here's the other tragedy is that the government subsidizes foster kids and even adopted. Like, you imagine already, like, you're adopted, you might have feelings about not belonging, and then being a foster kid, you've already been through all this trauma, then they ship you off to one of those places, and the government pays for it. Like, do you want your tax dollars paying for this? Really? Right? So yeah, tapping into the whole narcissistic parent thing. What a great way to get rid of your kid. What a great way to have someone else. It's like outsourcing the abuse, right? And then let's just get the kidnappers to really scare the crap out of that little brat, right? So again, you can see how this all ties in. I was gonna do originally a more structured video around this, but I have to say that, I'm gonna own up to my own, trauma, and I haven't been in one of these programs. But I do have some trauma with educators. I do have some institutional trauma in my background, and I found it was really incredibly triggering. And so I'm finding doing it in this format is a little less because I'm talking more off the cuff. I'm not using the imagery, and I am just speaking basically from the heart about how dangerous this is. These have to stop. We cannot continue treating kids like this. There are better options. Kids deserve to be seen, heard, treated with compassion. We need to lean into attachment. We need to lean into love and empathy. That is what helps all of us. When I work with my clients, that's the place I'm coming from. I don't work with teenagers or kids, but I did in some of my practicums. But that is how we need to treat each other. So these programs are the opposite of that. There couldn't be anything more opposite of therapeutic. This is torture. This is abuse. There are actual torture techniques that they do in North Korea that are employed in some of these places. We have kids going on basic death marches, kids just 20 miles a day across the hot desert in Utah, denied proper food, denied enough water, denied clothing, denied shelter. It's if you imagine how bad it could be, magnify that, multiply that by 20 times, and you're probably not even scratching the surface of horrific some of these programs are. As bad as Ivy Ridge is, there are ones that are even worse. I read a book recently by a survivor. She wrote about a group called The Family, and it was like a torture cult. Like I cannot, like some of the things I was reading, and she said no one would believe her because that it was so awful. No one can believe something could be that bad. And so I guess before I finish up today's live stream, I want to say that if you are a survivor, first of all, there is help available out there. Please take care of yourself and know that I believe you, I support you, and please get help. If you haven't already done so, find a good trauma therapist, find help. There are support groups, there are some programs. So if you can't afford a therapist, I'm going to have a list of resources that I'm going to put under my description later after this is posted. And I'm going to list all of these resources. There are some great websites out there, or places that, kind of a clearinghouse where you can go in to get support. Talk to other people. There are even some subreddit groups where you can talk to people. Don't do this alone. Reach out, find people you can talk to. There are people that believe you, that will support you. Do not let people gaslight you. You went through this experience. If you are someone who's been through any type of institutionalized abuse, so maybe it wasn't necessarily a troubling history, maybe it was a really abusive boarding school, maybe it was anything really, where you were put through that type of abuse. Same goes for you. Another thing I wanted to bring up quickly as well is part of that umbrella of that horrible industry is what's known as the gay conversion therapy. Again, that could be a whole other video, but it is also horrific practice. It's been banned in about 20 states so far. I hope that continues. It needs to be banned completely. In Canada, I think it's banned in most provinces, but there might be a few that are still allowing it. Ooh, I'm gonna have to look into that. And so first of all, yeah, you're fine the way you are. Like, however you're born, you're fine. And even then, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's how you're born, right? And it's incredibly damaging. So there's no world where anything like that should ever exist. So again, let's get rid of that too. Let's just put a stop to all of this. There are, again, I got some great resources from someone about things you could maybe do, like letter writing, contacting your representatives. Put pressure on people. I really hope that this documentary and the other ones that have been coming out are able to shed enough light. I know that it was one of, if not the most watched Netflix show in March. So I'm so glad this is coming to light. I'm so glad it's getting out there and that more people are aware of it and know about it and know how awful it is. This has been around for a while. I remember like the old Dr. Phil shows where they would cart kids off to boot camp, and don't get me started, Dr. Phil, by the way. Not even doctor anymore, but yeah, the damage that some of these people have caused, these so-called people that are, television shows, all that, they've caused by endorsing these types of things is just horrific. So just know, and if you're a parent, do not send your kids to one of these programs. Do not, please do not send them to anything like this. If you're not sure, first of all, don't let people scare you. Don't let people scare you. Most kids are going to outgrow it. The statistics of, that kids like die from these types of like overdose or whatever, it's very low. And again, I'm not saying you should never be concerned and never care about your kid, but there are other ways to help them. So if you are truly concerned about your kid, do your research, look at reputable programs, start with the start with the least structured thing, and you could always work your way up later. So just get a therapist, find a good therapist, start with that, right? If that maybe isn't quite enough, you could always talk to that person. Maybe they could recommend something for you or find other programs. And then, after that, maybe they might need something, a little more structured, maybe an outpatient type program or some sort of group to get involved with. And then the very, very last resort is a residential treatment program. Even those, like I said, they shouldn't be longer than a few weeks to maybe 6 weeks tops. Like, these are short term and you can visit, you have access to your kid. These are run by professionals. Again, I'm not endorsing any of these things. I'm just saying there are options out there. So do your research. Do not send your kid to anything like this, all right? Remember, these are money grabs, right? People are in this to make money. They're making a profit off of the misery of children and teenagers. So I'm going to sign off for now. I think this is long enough for today. I'm going to continue with these live streams. I have 0 views right now, so maybe I'll get more views later, but I'm going to keep doing them because it's kind of fun. It's kind of something a little different. And like I said, please, don't be shy, tell me what you'd like. I'd love your comments. I'd love to hear if you have any suggestions of things I can cover, things I can talk about. I'd love to, have this be a little more interactive and have people ask me questions maybe. But in the meantime, if you've made it this far, if you've watched any of this, I thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for more shorts, more long-form videos, more live streaming, more content in general. And I appreciate you and thank you for watching.